The west wing caught fire a little after 2 in the morning, and it was Eleanor who smelled the smoke before any bell was rung. She came awake already moving, the way she had trained herself to wake since girlhood, when she had kept her father's house on half a staff and no margin for sleep. And by the time Mrs. Pettigrew's fist found her door, she was already knotting a shawl over her nightgown and reaching for the ring of keys that hung, out of old habit rather than need, on a nail beside her bed. She did not yet know that the fire eating through the east end of Aldermere would accomplish in one night what 11 months of marriage had not. It would put her husband under her own roof, in her own rooms, close enough that she would hear him breathe through the wall. Had she known it then, standing barefoot on the scorched gravel, with the sky gone the colour of a struck match, she might almost have thanked the flames for their honesty. They, at least, did not pretend to be anything but what they were. The Duke of Aldermere's rooms were burning, and the Duke of Aldermere's wife was the one directing the bucket line, because the Duke of Aldermere's wife had learned long ago that a house does not care whose name is on the deed when it is deciding whether to fall down. She set the footman 2 abreast between the well and the east door, and made the stable boys carry water on the return trip instead of walking back empty-handed, and she did this without raising her voice above the crackle, because she had also learned that panic travels on volume and calm travels on example. It was nearly an hour before Julian came, not from his bed, for his bed was already burning, but from the stables, where he had been sitting up with a foaling mare who had chosen the worst possible night to be difficult. And the smoke had reached him before the shouting had. He arrived coatless, his shirt open at the throat, and for 1/2 of 1 second, before the 10 years of discipline closed back over his face, Eleanor saw something in him that had nothing to do with the fire in front of him, and everything to do with a fire long behind it. His hand went, without his seeming to notice it, to the old white scar that ran along the back of his left wrist. Then it was gone, and he was only a duke again, calling for the estate carpenter, asking who had checked the muniment room, asking it twice. By dawn the wing was a shell, blackened and steaming, and the household stood in the ash, smelling light, counting what remained, which was less than anyone wished to say aloud. The muniment room, where 3 generations of Aldermere's account books were kept, was ash down to the floorboards. Eleanor stood with her arms folded against the morning cold, and watched her husband stand very still in the ruin of his own bedroom, and she thought, not for the first time, that a house could be made to look tidy from the outside no matter what was rotting in its walls, and that perhaps people were built the same. It was Mr. Croft who arrived first among the neighbours, though no one had sent for him, and his own house lay 3 miles off across the river, and it was Mr. Croft who said, in the gentlest voice in a yard full of shouting, that it was providential. Truly providential, that no one had been sleeping in the study when the beam came down. He said it while straightening the cuff of his coat, which had somehow escaped a single smear of soot, and Eleanor, who made a study of hands the way other women made a study of faces, noted that his were very clean for a man claiming to have run the last mile. The accounts, he said, to no one and to everyone. The accounts are gone, your grace, every rent roll back to your father's time. And he said it with such soft sorrow that 3 separate housemaids reached for their aprons to dab their eyes, though the accounts were nothing to them. He did not say, though everyone in the yard already knew it without being told, that Mr. Josiah Pratt, the family's trustee under the late Duke's will, was expected at Aldermere in 5 weeks' time at Michaelmas to review those very books before the quarter's rents were settled and sealed. He did not need to say it. The date had been standing in the corner of every conversation at Aldermere for a month already, the way a storm stands on the horizon long before it breaks. And now it stood there still, except that the ledgers it had been waiting to examine were smoke going up over the elms. "The Duchess's rooms are untouched," Croft said next, mild as milk, "and large enough, I think, for both of you, until the wing is made right again," and he smiled at Eleanor as he said it, a smile with nothing behind it that she could find. Though she looked, because looking was the only thing she had ever been permitted to do freely in this house. Julian did not look at her at all. He looked at the ruin of his study a moment longer, his jaw set the particular way she had catalogued, over 11 silent months, as the shape his face made when he was refusing to feel something in front of witnesses, and then he said, to the yard in general, and to no one in particular, that Mr. Croft's suggestion would do. It would do for a month, he said, perhaps less, and then everyone could go back to where they belonged. He said it the way a man settles a bill he resents owing. Eleanor said nothing at all, only turned and went in to see that fresh linen was found, because it was, after all, going to be her rooms that had to hold him now. And there was no ledger anywhere in the world, hidden or otherwise, that could have told her yet what that would cost. He moved his things in that same afternoon, what little the fire had spared him. A shaving case, 3 shirts smelling of smoke no laundering ever fully drew out, a small travelling desk with a cracked lid, and he set them down in the dressing-room adjoining her bedchamber as though he were billeting in enemy territory, and meant to give as little offence as the terrain allowed. Eleanor stood in the doorway with her arms folded and watched him do it. "You needn't creep," she said. "It is still, technically, your house." "It is entirely my house," Julian said, not turning. "That is rather the trouble." He set the travelling desk on the small table by the window, the one she used for her correspondence, and did not ask whether he might. She let it go, filing the small trespass the way she filed everything, for later use or for none. "I will keep to the mornings," he said. "You may keep the evenings. We need not see one another above twice a day, if you manage it well." "I have managed a great deal with less goodwill than that," Eleanor said, and something in his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, gone before it could be called one. It was, she thought, the closest thing to warmth he had offered her since the church steps 11 months before, when he had taken her hand in front of a vicar and 40 curious neighbours, and said his vows in a voice that could have been reading out a lease. She remembered that day the way one remembers a bill correctly totalled, but bitterly paid. Her father had died in the spring, owing more than the small remaining Fenwick land could ever answer for, and the man holding the largest of those debts had made it clear, in the mild, unhurried way of men who never need to raise their voices to be obeyed, that the debt might be settled in ways other than coin, and that Miss Fenwick herself might be counted toward the balance. It was Julian, arriving in the neighbourhood that same month on business no one fully understood, who had quietly bought up the notes instead, and who had come to her with an offer, phrased so precisely as a transaction that she had almost admired the coldness of it, the way one admires a well-cut stone. "I require a duchess capable of running a large house without complaint," he had said, across her father's half-empty parlour, "and you require, I think, not to be auctioned to settle a stranger's ledger. Let us not call it more than it is." She had married him within the month, and had spent the 11 months since learning the precise geography of his silences, and had told herself, most nights, that a bargain honestly struck was worth more than a love dishonestly promised, and had mostly believed it. Mrs. Pettigrew, who had kept house at Aldermere since before Julian could walk and answered to no one's opinion of her tongue, found Eleanor that evening refolding shirts that did not need refolding, and said, without preamble, "Well, he's under your roof now, whatever he tells himself about whose house it is. Do him good, most like. Do who good? Him. Men like his Grace go soft in the wrong company and hard in the right, and I've watched you two long enough to know which he's been keeping." She wiped her hands on her apron, though they were perfectly dry, a habit so old it had worn a shine into the linen. "You'll want to mind that he doesn't like fire talked of. Never has." Eleanor filed that too, the way she filed everything, a small entry against a larger unread page. It was 3 days later that Mr. Croft came again, this time by design, riding over from his own modest house with a leather folder under his arm, and an expression of such careful sympathy that Eleanor, watching him dismount from the morning-room window, thought of a man arranging his face before a mirror. He was shown to Julian's borrowed corner of the library, where a temporary desk had been set among crates of salvaged papers, and Eleanor, who had legitimate business bringing a tray of tea to that same room, arrived in time to hear the tail end of his offer. "You need not trouble yourself with the reconstruction of the books, Your Grace," Croft was saying, turning his signet ring once around his finger, a small unconscious motion she would come to know very well before the year was out. "I have kept the estate's figures at my own hand these 11 years. Give me leave, and I will have fresh rolls drawn before Mr. Pratt ever sets foot past the gate, so that his visit need trouble no one." "That is a generous offer," Julian said, in the flat voice he kept for men he did not fully trust, and could not yet afford to distrust openly. "I had rather thought to go over the surviving leases myself." Of course, Croft said, spreading his clean hands. "Only there is little enough surviving to go over, and a great deal of it in my head besides, from long handling. It would spare you the tedium. At a season when you have," here his eyes moved, briefly and without seeming to move at all, toward Eleanor in the doorway, "other domestic matters requiring your patience." He said it kindly. That was the worst of it, Eleanor thought, setting down the tray with rather more care than it required. He never once raised his voice. Not in 11 years of quietly running Aldermere's ledgers. If half of what the servants murmured about his temper as a younger man was true, and a threat delivered gently loses none of its edge for the softness of its wrapping. Below in the village that week, at the corn chandler's and outside the smithy, the talk was all of the fire and the odd arrangement it had produced, and the betting book kept behind the counter at the Feathers took on a new page devoted entirely to how long the ice between the Duke and Duchess would hold now that necessity had put them under one roof, the odds running heavily toward no thaw at all before Christmas. Eleanor heard none of this directly, being a duchess, and therefore the last to hear anything said honestly about herself, but Mrs. Pettigrew heard it and reported it with relish, and it was at the corn chandler's, buying seed for the still-room garden, that Eleanor first heard the small crack that would in time open into everything. A tenant's wife, old Sarah Duckett from the home farm, complained without rancour that the rent she had actually paid at Lady Day did not match the sum written against her name when her husband asked to see the roll, being unlettered himself and anxious that no error should sit against them. £10 we paid, my lady, sure as I'm standing here, and the book says 8, she said, and laughed it off as a clerk's slip of the pen, the kind of small domestic arithmetic that meant nothing to anyone but a farmer's wife, counting her winter stores. Eleanor laughed with her, and paid for her seed, and walked home turning the number over and over like a stone in her pocket. because 8 from 10 was £2 unaccounted for on one farm alone, and Aldermere held 40 farms, and she had spent 11 months of quiet evenings with nothing better to do than keep her own books out of long habit, and she knew, the way she knew the weight of a coin by its ring on stone, that numbers left carelessly wrong were rarely wrong by accident more than once. The evenings, it turned out, were harder to divide cleanly than Julian had proposed, because a man cannot answer 5 weeks of correspondence from a burned study with only mornings to do it in, and so by the second week he had taken to working at the small table in her sitting room after supper, where the light was better, and the fire, ironically, was kept smaller and more carefully watched than anywhere else in the house. Eleanor worked opposite him most nights with her own small book of household accounts, and it was easier, she found, to speak across a shared task than across a shared silence, the way two strangers on a coach find conversation more possible when there is a window to look out of together. "You keep your figures in a curious hand," Julian said one night, not looking up from the letter he was drafting, and she realised he had glanced across at her book more than once without her noticing. "My father kept it," she said. The old style, tallying pence separately from pounds. He said a column that could be checked twice was worth more than a column that looked handsome once. And do you check it twice? Always. Numbers do not lie, Your Grace. Only the people who copy them do. He looked at her properly then, for longer than a glance, and something crossed his face that she filed under a heading she had not yet named. "My father used to say something very like that," he said, though rather less charitably about the people. It was the nearest either of them had come to speaking of fathers, hers ruined and dead, his dead too, though not ruined, and she let the silence after it sit unfilled rather than crowd it, because she had learned that with this particular man, silence handled gently sometimes yielded more than questions ever did. It yielded, that night, the smallest fraction of the truth she had been keeping to herself since her father's death, that she had gone on keeping her own private book of figures long after there was any household left to justify it, tallying what tenants told her at market against what she could glean of the estate's public numbers, not because she suspected anything in particular at Aldermere when she began it, but because a woman whose father died believing himself a fool with sums never quite trusts a column of figures again, unless she has checked it with her own hand. She told him that much. She did not tell him about Sarah Duckett's 2 missing pounds, not yet, because the words had not fully arranged themselves in her own mind into an accusation she was prepared to make against a man as careful as Aldous Croft, and because some instinct older than reason told her that a half-formed suspicion spoken too soon dies of exposure before it can be proven. Julian did not press her. He only nodded, and bent back to his letter, and some minutes later, when Mrs. Pettigrew put her head round the door to report that the new plasterer had got roaring drunk and proposed marriage to the dairymaid on a step-ladder, Julian laughed, not the dry huff he sometimes allowed himself, but an actual laugh, startled out of him. That changed the whole architecture of his face, for the 3 seconds it lasted. Eleanor found she had been holding her breath to hear it, and did not examine too closely why. It could not last, of course, because nothing gentle at Aldermere that autumn was permitted to last uninterrupted by Aldous Croft, who called again 8 days later with a fresh page of figures, and a fresh softness in his voice, and who found a moment alone with Julian in the stable yard, ostensibly to discuss a strayed boundary hedge, and used it to plant something far more precise than a hedge. "I do not like to carry tales," he said, which was, Eleanor would later learn, the sentence he always used directly before carrying one. "But you should know, Your Grace, that Her Grace has been asking a great many questions of the tenants this month. Old Duckett's wife, Tom Ives, others besides. Questions about rents, about figures." He let that sit, turning his ring. "I mention it only because her own father, God rest him, was known to keep somewhat creative accounts in his last years, before the ruin came on him. It would grieve me to think old habits had followed her into a new house. But I dare say Your Grace knows her mind better than I." He said it so gently, so full of reluctant concern, that it took root before Julian had thought to question the soil it was planted in. And that evening, when Eleanor came in from the still room smelling of lavender and beeswax, she found her husband standing by the cold hearth, with a stillness in him she had not seen since the fire. "I am told," he said without preface, "that you have been asking the tenants about rents." "I have. Why, it was not a question so much as a demand wearing a question's clothes, and Eleanor felt the old instinct rise in her, the one that had kept her safe and small for 11 months, urging her to soften the answer, to make it smaller than it was. She did not obey it. "Because a farmer's wife told me she paid £10, and the roll says 8, she said. "And because I have spent my life learning that figures wrong by accident are rarely wrong only once. And because I did not think, until this moment, that I would need permission to add a column in my own home." "This is not your home to audit," Julian said, and the word audit came out of him harder than he seemed to intend, as though it had cost him something to say. "It is my family's estate, and my family's ledgers, burned or not, and I will not have—" He stopped himself. "Show me your book," he said instead, "the one you keep. If you have found errors, show me the proof, and we will settle it properly." "It is not finished," Eleanor said, which was true, and which was also, she knew even as she said it, going to sound to a suspicious man exactly like a lie. "It is not ready to be shown." "Not ready," Julian repeated, and something closed in his face, a door she had watched open by inches over 2 weeks, now swinging shut in a single motion. "No," he said. "I imagine it is not." He did not raise his voice. He never did. He only turned and went to the desk in the corner and did not speak to her again that night. And Eleanor stood by the door with her hands very still at her sides, and understood, with the flat clarity of a woman totalling a column she already knows will not balance, that gentleness handled gently had just been turned, by a soft-voiced man with clean hands, into a weapon pointed at the very thing that had begun to grow warm between them. The quarrel did not end there, because quarrels born of a lie half-believed rarely end in a single evening. It settled instead into a cold correctness that was, Eleanor thought, worse than the old distance had ever been, because now they both knew what warmth had felt like, and could measure the loss of it precisely. It was into this cold that Aldous Croft rode again, 3 days on, finding Eleanor alone in the still room, grinding lavender for the wax she used to seal her father's old book, and he came to the point with a directness that surprised her, though she supposed a man rarely troubles to be subtle with someone he believes already cornered. "I have heard," he said, leaning in the doorway with the ease of a man who considers every room at Aldermere half his own, "that there has been some unpleasantness over figures. I am sorry for it. I would not wish old questions about your father's affairs stirred up before Mr. Pratt's visit. For your sake as much as anyone's, a trustee reviewing accounts is not always inclined to be delicate about what family history he uncovers along the way." He let the threat sit a moment, wrapped, as ever, in wool. It would cost me nothing to see that no one troubles you about the Fenwick debts again, once they are fully cleared from Aldermere's books. A quiet word from me, and the matter is closed forever. All I would ask in return is that you set aside your own tallying. Leave the figures to those paid to keep them. It is, after all, only prudent. In a house where your position is still so new. Eleanor set down her pestle very precisely, and looked at him the way she had learned to look at ledgers that did not balance, patiently and without heat. "You are offering to bury my father's name," she said, "in exchange for my blindness. I am offering you peace, your grace." "My father," Eleanor said, "spent the last year of his life believing he had failed through his own stupidity, and it broke something in him that never mended before he died. I have spent every year since making certain I never mistake another man's fraud for my own failure again. I will not trade that certainty for your peace, Mr. Croft, at any price you care to name." Something moved behind his mild eyes then, gone as fast as it came, and he straightened his cuff, and said only that he hoped she would not come to regret her thoroughness, and left her standing among the lavender with her hands, she noticed only afterward, shaking very slightly, not from fear, but from the particular cost of having refused something that would have made her life so very much easier to carry. That refusal brought her nothing but isolation in the weeks that followed. Word reached Julian, through channels she never fully traced, that his wife had been overheard speaking sharply to Mr. Croft, and the household, taking its temperature as households always do from the coldest room in it, began to treat her with the careful distance owed to someone under a cloud no one troubled to name aloud. At a small dinner got up for the visiting magistrate, she caught two matrons exchanging a look over her head, when the subject of the fire arose, and Julian, seated the length of a long table from her, did not once come to her defence, though she told herself, in the small hours afterward, that a man cannot defend a wife whose evidence he has never been shown, and that the fault for that silence was as much hers as his. It was into this darkest stretch that a parcel arrived from the home farm, delivered by Tom Ives's boy on a Thursday, with a note in a careful, labouring hand that had cost its writer, Eleanor suspected, most of an evening to compose. Old Ducket had found, tucked behind a loose stone in the dairy wall, where his family had kept such things since his grandfather's day, a bundle of receipts going back 6 years, every one signed by Aldous Croft's own hand, every one showing sums that did not match the figures entered against the Ducket name in the estate's rolls. Eleanor sat with the bundle spread across her father's old book long after the candle had guttered low, matching each yellowed slip against the tallies she had already gathered from a dozen other tenants over the past month, and the pattern that emerged was no longer a suspicion. It was a column that would not balance no matter how many times she added it, and it pointed, with the flat indifference numbers always show to the feelings of the men they condemn, directly at Aldous Croft. She sat a long time with the proof in her lap, and the house gone silent around her, and the question she could not answer, not that night, was not whether the evidence was sound. It was whether she dared carry it down the corridor to a husband who had already told her, in as many words, that he did not believe she had any evidence to carry at all. She did not have to decide alone, in the end, because Mrs. Pettigrew decided for her, arriving at Eleanor's door before breakfast the next morning, with her apron still dusted in flour, and her jaw set in the particular line that meant she had already said her piece to someone, and did not intend to be argued out of having said it. "I have told His Grace he is a fool," she announced without preamble, and he did not care for hearing it, but he heard it all the same, which is more than I expected. It transpired that she had gone to Julian directly, blunt as a hammer, and told him plainly that she had known him since he was in short coats, and had never once seen him refuse to look at proof before he had a reason to be afraid of what it showed, and that whatever fear the fire had woken in him about ledgers and ruin was making a coward of a man who had never been one in his life. Julian came to Eleanor's sitting room himself an hour later, standing in the doorway the way he had stood there on the first day, as though asking permission he was too proud to voice, and said only, "Show me." And this time it was not a demand wearing a question's clothes. It was, Eleanor understood, as near to an apology as a man like him knew how to make, without unmaking himself entirely, and she spread 6 years of Aldous Croft's own handwriting across the table between them, and let the figures speak for her, because figures, unlike people, had never once lied to her. They spent the rest of that day, and most of the next, building the case in full, and it was Eleanor's idea, not his, to send a quiet word to Lady Cordelia Vane, the cool, correct young woman whose family had once all but arranged a match between herself and Julian before his father's death rearranged every fortune in the county, and who had spent 11 months since Eleanor's marriage dropping small, polished remarks about the new Duchess's origins into every drawing-room she entered. Eleanor went to her directly, without apology for the visit's oddness, and showed her 1 page only, a receipt bearing Cordelia's own family seal, a rent Croft had collected on her mother's dower land, and recorded at half its true sum. Cordelia went very pale, and touched the pearl at her throat, and said after a long silence that she had always found Mr. Croft's condolences a fraction too well rehearsed, and that she would say so, publicly, if asked. It was, Eleanor thought, the first honest thing she had ever heard the woman say. Meanwhile Julian, working a channel of his own, sent word to Josiah Pratt asking that the McCalmus audit proceed exactly as scheduled and exactly as public as the will required, no earlier and no smaller, and it was this, more than anything else. That first cracked the composure Aldous Croft had worn without a seam for 11 years. A stable boy reported him seen at the home farm at dusk, speaking low and urgent to Nathan Coombe, the undergroom who had helped carry lamp oil the night of the fire, and though no one could say what passed between them, Coombe was seen afterwards sitting alone on an upturned bucket with his head in his hands, and did not touch his supper. McCalmus came in on a morning so still and dry that the drought which had lain over the county since midsummer seemed, that day of all days, to be holding its breath along with everyone else. Josiah Pratt arrived by 10, a spare, precise man, who greeted the household with the courtesy of someone who had long ago learned that courtesy costs nothing, and reveals a great deal about who deserves the withholding of it, and the library, salvaged crates and all, was set with chairs enough for Julian, Eleanor, Croft, Pratt, Mrs. Pettigrew standing grim by the door, Cordelia seated with her hands folded very correctly in her lap, and Nathan Coombe brought in last, pale and unwilling, between 2 footmen who had been told only that his presence was required. Croft came in smiling, his ring turning once around his finger, his cuffs, as ever, immaculate, and he laid his own freshly copied rolls upon the table with the easy confidence of a man who has performed this exact courtesy 11 autumns running. "I have done what I can with what the fire left us," he said, and there was real sorrow in it, real enough to have moved a room that did not already know better. "It is imperfect work, built from memory in places, but I trust it will satisfy." "It will not be necessary," Julian said, and nodded to Eleanor, and it was Eleanor who rose and set her father's small calfskin book upon the table, beside Croft's handsome new rolls, worn soft at the corners, smelling faintly of beeswax and lavender even across the width of the table. She pressed the hidden clasp at the base of the spine, the one her father had built into the binding himself in the year before his death, not trusting even his own house to keep a secret safe, and drew out a folded sheaf of receipts that had waited 6 years behind a dairy wall to be read aloud in the light. "These are signed in Mr. Croft's own hand," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, she noted with some distant satisfaction, had finally stopped. "I have matched each one against the sum entered in the estate's public rolls for the same tenant, the same quarter, the same year. I invite Mr. Pratt to do the same." Pratt did methodically, laying receipt beside roll, reading each pair of figures aloud in his flat trustee's voice, and the gap between what tenants had paid and what Aldermere's books recorded grew, entry by entry, into a sum too large to be called a clerk's error by anyone still capable of shame. Croft's smile did not move for the first 4 entries. It moved on the 5th, a small tightening at the corner of his mouth, and by the 10th his hand had gone still on his ring rather than turning it, which Eleanor understood, having watched that hand for a month, to be the truest sign yet that the ground beneath him had opened. It was Julian who turned, at last, to Nathan Coombe, and asked him a single question, quietly, the way a man asks something he already half knows the answer to, and wants only to hear said aloud in front of witnesses. "Who told you to move the lamp oil out of the store and into the muniment room the night of the fire, Nathan?" Coombe's composure, thinner by far than his master's, did not last through a second question. He wept before he spoke, and when he spoke it came out of him all at once, in a rush, that Mr. Croft had ordered it done a full week before, that he had been promised a place in London and money, besides if he did as he was told, and said nothing after, that he had not meant for anyone to be hurt, only for the old books to burn, before the new gentleman's marriage brought a trustee, poking too closely into figures Mr. Croft had been quietly adjusting since before the old Duke died. Pratt produced, from Coombe's own coat pocket, surrendered without further struggle, a folded note in Croft's unmistakable hand, promising exactly the sum and exactly the silence Coombe had described, and Pratt read it aloud in full, every careful damning word of it, into a room that had gone entirely still. Croft did not deny it. He sat instead very straight in his chair, and for one unguarded moment, before the mask could be found and refitted, something naked crossed his face, not cunning, but grief, old and long buried, and he said, in a voice gone suddenly unlike his own, that the old Duke had raised him from the age of 9 as good as a son, had promised him, more than once and in more than one drunk fond hour, that Aldermere would see him provided for as family and not as staff, and that when the old man died there had been nothing in the will for him at all beyond the steward's post, as though 9 years of being called son had been a kindness extended and then quietly withdrawn the moment it grew inconvenient to keep. "I only ever took," he said, "what I believed I had been owed, and was never given honestly." No one in the room answered that directly, because there was, Eleanor thought, no answer that would not sound either cruel or false, and it was Julian, after a long silence, who spoke, and what he said surprised her more than anything the day had yet produced. "You will not be prosecuted," he said. "There will be no trial, no charge laid, no word of arson or fraud carried beyond this room. You will have an allowance, modest but sufficient, paid quarterly through Mr. Pratt, on the condition that you remove yourself from this county within the month, and do not return while I live." Croft's head came up sharply. "Mercy, your grace? Not for your sake," Julian said. "For the tenants who would suffer a scandal's fallout longer than they would suffer your absence. And for a name I would rather my wife's children inherited whole than stained by a trial that would cost this house more than it could ever recover in satisfaction." Outside, as he said it, the first fat drops of rain in 11 dry weeks began to strike the library windows, and by the time Croft had been led out, quiet now, diminished, no longer smiling, the drought that had lain over the county since midsummer broke at last into a hard, steady, cleansing rain that could be heard drumming on the new slate of the rebuilt wing long after everyone else had gone from the room. They stood together afterward at the library window, watching the rain come down over the wet black ruin of the old east wing and the pale new timber rising beside it, and it was Julian who spoke first, which was itself so unusual a thing that Eleanor turned to look at him before he had finished the sentence. "I told you once," he said, "not to call our arrangement more than it was. I find, this evening, that I can no longer call it less than everything, and I do not know how to say that without it sounding like a debt I owe you for proving me a fool." "You owe me nothing," Eleanor said. "I did not do it to be owed." "I know it," he said. "That is rather the whole of my trouble. A man can repay a debt easily enough. I do not know what to do with a woman who wants nothing back." "Marry me properly, then," she said, before she had entirely decided to say it, since the first time was only ever a bargain struck across my father's table. "Not because the estate requires it, or because I have proven myself useful, or because you owe me a kindness for a ledger well kept. Only because you wish it." "I have wished it," Julian said, "for rather longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself," and he took her hand then, not as he had on the church steps 11 months before, formally for witnesses, but simply because he wanted to hold it, and something in Eleanor that had been braced and careful for 11 months quietly, finally set its burden down. They were married again 3 weeks later, in the small stone chapel behind the house, with no guests but the household and the tenants whose receipts had won the day, and Mrs. Pettigrew wept without shame through the whole of it, and claimed afterward, wiping her perfectly dry hands on her apron, that it was only the incense making her eyes run. Cordelia Vane stood among the witnesses in a gown of unshowy grey, and left Aldermere the following spring for her aunt's house in Bath, where she was within the year, respectably and rather happily married to a widowed magistrate twice her own age, of good humour and better sense, and wrote to Eleanor now and again in a hand that had, at last, entirely dropped its old polish for something warmer. Nathan Coombe, whose weeping confession had broken the case open, was spared prosecution in exchange for full testimony, and sent instead to a cousin's farm in the north, with a character that named him a fool rather than a criminal, which Eleanor privately judged the truer of the two. Aldous Croft went abroad within the month, as he had been bidden, and it was nearly 2 years before a single letter came back from him, addressed to no one but Pratt, thanking him, with what read like genuine and hard-won humility, for a mercy he said he had done nothing in his life to earn, and did not expect ever to be offered again. Among his abandoned papers, sorted at last by Pratt's careful hand, was found an old partnership deed bearing the signature of Aldous Croft's own father, dated some 30 years before, proving beyond any further dispute that Thomas Fenwick, Eleanor's father, had been cheated out of half his land by a Croft a full generation before this one, and had died believing the ruin his own fault when it had never been his fault at all. Eleanor had the deed framed, not the ledger, and hung it quietly in the estate library where anyone might read it, because a wrong long carried in silence deserved, she thought, to be finally spoken aloud even after the ears that needed most to hear it had gone still. The east wing was finished by the following spring, every room restored, the muniment room rebuilt with a fireproof door the old Duke would never have thought to install, and a new set of ledgers kept, by mutual and cheerful agreement, in Eleanor's curious double-checked hand. Julian never moved back into it, he said, when Mrs. Pettigrew asked him outright why a duke should go on living in his wife's rooms, when perfectly good rooms of his own stood empty and waiting, that he had tried a month in his wife's rooms once, against his will, and found afterward that his own held nothing in them he wanted half so much as what he had found in hers, and that a man who had learned that lesson once did not care to be taught it twice. A year on almost to the week, on an evening gone gold and quiet after another hot, dry summer, Eleanor stood again at that same window, with her husband's hand loosely in hers, listening to the wrens that had nested that spring in the ivy along the new stone, singing the same busy evening song they had sung the night the old wing burned, and Julian, watching the light move across the wet slate roof, said that he had spent a great deal of his life believing a man's whole duty was to choose what he would save before it was taken from him. He had learned, this past year, that the harder and better duty was choosing, every ordinary day afterward, to stay. If a story like this one has ever warmed you, the story of a woman whose careful counting was mistaken for coldness until it saved a whole house, and a man who had to lose his own rooms before he understood which room was truly his, then pull your chair a little nearer the fire and stay a while longer with me. I keep this hearth lit for exactly this kind of evening, a kettle always near the boil, and a chair always kept for whoever wanders in, wanting one more story before bed. Tell me, in the comments, which moment stayed with you longest, the receipts behind the dairy wall, the wrens in the ivy, or the quiet way he finally said stay instead of go. And if you'd like to keep a seat by this fire for the next story, and the one after that, consider subscribing. It costs you nothing, and it means a great deal to a storyteller who likes company. Until then, sleep well, and be gentle with the ones who counted your columns twice when no one asked them to.